The wind was a thief, stealing the warmth from Alara's bones and the soil from her land. It howled across the plains of the Dakota Territory, a mournful, ceaseless cry that stripped the paint from her small clapboard house and rattled the very memory of hope from its foundations. Dust, fine as milled flour, seeped through every crack, coating the table where she sat, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white peaks in a landscape of chapped skin. It was the color of despair, this dust. The color of the world after her husband, Thomas, was gone. It settled on the cold stove, on the single plate she hadn't the heart to wash, on the faded photograph of a smiling man whose eyes promised a future that had been buried with him 6 months prior. The land, their dream, was now her purgatory. A vast, empty expanse that mirrored the hollow ache in her chest. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of brown grit and fury. The sun was a tarnished coin obscured by the choking haze. This was more than a storm. It was a judgment. Jedediah Kane's men had left an hour ago. Their laughter, sharp and cruel as shattered glass, still echoed in the wind's shriek. They had trampled the small garden she'd tried to cultivate, kicked over her water barrel, and left their warning hanging in the air like the scent of cheap whiskey and malice. "Mr. Kane ain't a patient man, Mrs. Vance." The one with the scarred lip had sneered, his gaze crawling over her with a proprietary insolence. "He's made you a generous offer. A final one. Sign the deed, or he'll have this land, one way or another." The offer was a pittance, an insult to the sweat and blood Thomas had poured into this unforgiving soil. But Kane owned the valley, the water rights, the lawmen in the nearest town, and, it seemed, the very air they all breathed. He was a patient predator, circling, waiting for her to break. And she was breaking. The fear was a cold stone in her stomach, a constant, heavy companion. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Through the grime-streaked window, a shape began to resolve itself out of the swirling dust. It was indistinct at first, a smudge of darker gray against the brown tempest, moving with a slowness that was either exhaustion or deliberation. A man on a horse as gaunt and weary as the rider looked to be. They moved as one entity, a ghost conjured from the storm itself, trudging toward her homestead as if it were the last point of solace in a dying world. Fear, sharp and immediate, lanced through her. Kane's men returning? No. This figure was solitary. There was no swagger, no casual cruelty in its posture. There was only a profound weariness, a sense of a long and brutal road traveled. He did not ride for the house, but for the trough by the barn, a gesture of a man who understood the priorities of survival. Horse first, always. It was a detail Thomas would have approved of. The thought brought a fresh pang of grief, so sharp it stole her breath. She watched, her hand creeping toward the old shotgun Thomas had kept propped behind the door. It was heavy, unfamiliar in her grasp. She knew how to load it, but the thought of firing it at another human being made her feel ill. The man dismounted, his movements economical and stiff. He was tall, lean, his duster the same color as the dust-choked sky. He worked the pump handle, the squeal of the dry mechanism a raw nerve in the storm's roar. Water, thick with rust and sediment at first, finally gushed out. He let the horse drink its fill before cupping his own hands, splashing the gritty water onto a face she couldn't see, hidden as it was by the brim of a battered hat. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, a solitary pillar against the rage of the elements. He seemed less a man and more a piece of the landscape, weathered and enduring. He had not looked toward the house, had made no move, but she felt his awareness of her as a palpable thing. He knew he was being watched. The knowledge did not make him tense, it simply was. He was a man accustomed to being observed, to living on the precarious edge where any shadow could hold a friend or a foe. When he finally turned, the wind tearing at his coat, his gaze met hers through the window, and in that instant, the world seemed to fall silent. His eyes, even from that distance, held the same bleak emptiness as the land around them. The silence that fell between them when she opened the door was heavier than the dust-laden air. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, a gesture of respect that seemed at odds with the harsh lines of his face. Close up, he was older than she'd first thought, the skin around his eyes a fine web of creases carved by sun and hardship. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, like a winter sky, and they held a stillness that was deeply unsettling. They looked not at her, but through her, as if seeing the ghost of every person he had ever met. He didn't speak, merely waited, his presence a quiet question. "The horse can have the barn," she heard herself say, her voice thin and reedy against the wind. "There's hay, not much, but it's dry." He gave a single, curt nod. His gaze flickered past her into the small, dim room, taking in the layer of dust, the unwashed plate, the palpable air of neglect and sorrow. He saw it all, she knew. He saw the fraying edges of her existence. "Obliged," he said. The word was rough, as if unused to forming. It was the only word he offered as he turned and led his horse toward the shelter of the barn. She watched him go, the shotgun still a cold, heavy weight in her hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door, to hide, to treat this stranger as the threat he almost certainly was. A lone man in this territory was either running from something or looking for trouble, often both. Yet she had offered him shelter. Some part of her, the part that remembered Thomas's simple decency, the part that recoiled from the idea of turning away any creature in a storm like this, had spoken for her. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the profound loneliness, the crushing weight of her fear that made the presence of another soul, even a potentially dangerous one, a strange and paradoxical comfort. She closed the door, the latch clicking with a sound of finality, and leaned against it, listening to the storm. She was no longer entirely alone with it. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, she did not yet know. She only knew that something had changed. The static pattern of her grief and terror had been disrupted by the arrival of the man with winter in his eyes. He worked without being asked. The next morning, the storm had broken, leaving behind a world scoured clean and bathed in a pale, fragile light. Ilara awoke to the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood. Peering out the window, she saw him, the drifter, mending the section of fence Kane's men had splintered. He moved with an unhurried efficiency, each motion precise and purposeful. He had found the spare lumber stacked behind the barn, located the tools in Thomas's old chest, and set to the task as if it were his own. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. He worked like a man who found solace in the simple, honest language of labor. She watched him for nearly an hour, a knot of confusion and suspicion tightening in her stomach. No one did anything for nothing out here. Charity was a currency scarcer than water. She dressed and went outside, the morning air cold and sharp in her lungs. He didn't stop his work as she approached, only acknowledged her presence with a slight inclination of his head. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said, her voice betraying a defensiveness she hadn't intended. He drove another nail home before turning to face her. His gray eyes were clear in the morning light, and they held no readable expression. It needed doing, he stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He was a man of few words, and each one seemed to carry the weight of a dozen unsaid. "I can't pay you," she said, the admission a fresh wave of shame. "Didn't ask for pay." He picked up another plank of wood, testing its strength in his hands. "You gave my horse shelter from the storm. Mending a fence is fair trade." His logic was simple, direct, and left no room for argument. It was a transaction, an evening of the scales. Yet it felt like more. It felt like a quiet rebuke to the cruelty she had come to expect from the world. He wasn't just mending a fence. He was restoring a small piece of order to the chaos that had engulfed her life. That day set the pattern for the days that followed. He never said his name, and she never asked. He simply stayed. He slept in the barn, rising before the sun and working until it bled below the horizon. He cleaned the well Kane's men had fouled, pulling up bucket after bucket of stagnant, contaminated water until it ran clear and sweet again. He rehung the barn door that had been knocked from its leather hinges. He patched a hole in the roof of the house, his silhouette a stark figure against the vast, indifferent sky. He moved about her property with a quiet ownership that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. He asked for nothing but a plate of food at the end of the day, which he ate on the porch steps, even as the evenings grew colder. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a thing of gestures and shared silence. She would leave a bucket of fresh water by the barn door in the morning. He would leave a small pile of chopped firewood on her porch in the evening. She began to study him, to learn the topography of his silence. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and strong, were gentle when he handled her remaining livestock, a few scrawny chickens and a single milk cow. She saw the tension that never truly left his shoulders, the way he would pause in his work and scan the horizon, his gaze distant and searching. He was a man perpetually on watch. One evening, she brought his plate out to the porch, and instead of retreating back inside, she sat on the top step, a few feet away from him. He didn't acknowledge her presence for a long time, simply continued to eat, his focus on his plate. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple. "My husband, Thomas," she said into the quiet, the words feeling clumsy and loud. "He loved this land, said it was honest. It gives you nothing you don't earn." The stranger stopped eating. He didn't look at her, but she felt the shift in his attention. "He was a good man," she finished, her voice thick with unshed tears. The stranger was silent for a moment more. Then he set his plate aside. "Good men die same as the rest," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It was not a cruel statement, but a simple, hard-won truth. It was the bleakest comfort she had ever been offered, and yet it was a comfort nonetheless. He was not a man who dealt in platitudes or easy lies. He dealt in the world as it was, and in that moment she found she was grateful for it. The fragile peace his presence had created was shattered a week later. Two of Cain's men rode onto her property, their horses kicking up dust in a show of arrogant disregard. Alara was by the chicken coop, and her blood ran cold at the sight of them. It was the man with the scarred lip and another, a burly man with a mean, pinched face. They reined in their horses, their expressions a mixture of surprise and annoyance at the sight of the mended fence and the general air of order that had been restored. Then they saw the drifter. He was standing by the barn, a pitchfork in his hand. Though he held it loosely, his posture deceptively relaxed. He didn't move, just watched them, his gray eyes flat and unreadable. "Well, look what we have here," Scarlip said, a smirk twisting his mouth. "Looks like the widow found herself some help." His eyes raked over Alara, making her feel soiled. "Or is it company?" The drifter said nothing. His stillness was more potent than any threat. It was a deep, coiled silence, like that of a snake before it strikes. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made both men shift in their saddles. "This is Cain's land," the burly one spat, "or it will be soon enough, and this is a warning. For you." He pointed a thick finger at the drifter. "And for her. Next time we come, it won't be to talk." The drifter took a slow step forward. "There won't be a next time," he said. The finality in his tone was absolute. It was not a boast or a threat. It was a statement of fact. For a terrifying moment, the air crackled with tension. Scarlip's hand hovered near the butt of his pistol. The drifter didn't even glance at the weapon. His focus remained entirely on the man's eyes. Alara could feel the violence coiled in him, a palpable force held in check by a will of iron. He was a predator, she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach. A predator who had chosen, for now, to be her protector. The moment stretched, thin and taut. Then, with a curse, Scarlip seemed to make a decision. There was something in the drifter's gaze, a promise of swift and terrible consequence that made him hesitate. He was a bully, not a fool. He knew when he was outmatched, even if he didn't understand how. "This ain't over," he snarled, pulling his horse's reins hard. He and his companion wheeled their mounts around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in their wake. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees weak with relief and a new, more profound fear. The drifter watched them until they were small specks on the horizon. He then turned, his expression unchanged, and went back to his work as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A line had been drawn, and the quiet man who worked her land had just placed himself firmly on her side of it. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of his face, the cold certainty in his eyes, was burned into her mind. Who was he? What kind of man could face down armed riders with nothing but his own presence? The question echoed in the dark, and for the first time, she felt a sliver of hope, sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street flanked by false-fronted buildings, a place where hope came to die. Ilara rode in on her wagon 2 days after the confrontation, the need for supplies overriding her desire to stay hidden. The drifter had insisted on coming with her. He hadn't asked. He had simply saddled his horse and followed her wagon, keeping a steady, watchful distance. His presence was a comfort and a liability. People stared as they passed. The townsfolk, who had once been her neighbors and friends, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt, their loyalty bought and paid for by Jedediah Kane. Whispers followed her into the general store like biting flies. "That's her, Vance's widow. Heard she's got some drifter shacked up with her. Shameless." Each word was a small, sharp cut. She kept her head held high, her face a stoic mask, but inside she was crumbling. While she was trading her last few eggs for flour and salt, the drifter stood outside, his back against a support post, seemingly at ease. But she could see his gaze sweeping the street, missing nothing. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a drooping mustache and Kane's coin in his pocket, swaggered out of his office. He stopped in front of the drifter, puffing out his chest. "You the stray the widow picked up?" Brody asked, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. The drifter didn't respond, his silence an insult. "I don't like your face, drifter," Brody pressed on, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "This is a decent town. We don't take kindly to your sort. I suggest you move on." The drifter slowly pushed himself off the post. He was taller than the sheriff and leaner, but he seemed to take up more space, to possess a density that made the lawman look soft and trivial. "I'll move on when I'm ready," he said, his voice a low rumble. His gaze dropped to the sheriff's hand, then back to his eyes. It was a clear, unambiguous dismissal. Sheriff Brody's face flushed a deep red. He was used to being feared, or at least obeyed. He opened his mouth to retort, but something in the drifter's cold, gray eyes made him reconsider. With a sputtered curse, Brody turned and stalked back to his office. Later that afternoon, while waiting for the blacksmith to reshoe one of her horses, Ilara found herself drawn to the sheriff's office. A collection of sun-bleached wanted posters was tacked to a board outside. She scanned them idly at first, then with a growing sense of dread. Her eyes snagged on a drawing, old and creased, the ink faded by years of sun and rain. The face was younger, the lines less harsh, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the same winter gray, the same haunted stillness. Beneath the sketch, the words were stark. Wanted, dead or alive. Silas Kane. For robbery and murder in the Cimarron territory. Known as the Ghost. $500 reward. Silas. The name felt alien. The man she knew was a creature of silence and work, not a named outlaw with a price on his head. Her blood turned to ice. The ghost of the Cimarron. She'd heard the stories, whispered around campfires and in saloons. A gunslinger of legendary speed and lethality, a man who left a trail of bodies behind him before vanishing like smoke. She felt a wave of dizziness and leaned against the wall for support. The man mending her fences, the man who had faced down Kane's thugs and the town sheriff, was a killer, a wanted man, and he was living in her barn. That evening, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a space of tentative understanding, but a chasm of unspoken accusations and fear. She served him his meal, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the plate. He took it, his gaze lingering on her face for a fraction longer than usual, a question in his eyes. She couldn't bear it. She had to know. She waited until he was finished eating, then walked out onto the porch, the folded wanted poster clutched in her hand. She didn't speak, just held it out to him. He looked at it, his face impassive in the fading light. He showed no surprise, no shame, no denial. He simply looked from the weathered paper back to her face, his expression unreadable. "Is it you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Some of it's true," he said, his voice raspy. "The parts that matter, I suppose." A torrent of questions rose in her throat. Why was he here? What did he want? Was he going to kill her too? But looking at him, at the profound weariness in his posture, the deep-seated sorrow in his eyes, she found she couldn't ask. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with a strange, unwelcome empathy. He was not the monster from the stories. He was a man, haunted and broken, who had somehow washed up on the shores of her own broken life. "Cain's men, they'll be back," she said, changing the subject, her voice shaking. "They'll bring more men next time." "I know," he said. He looked out at the vast, darkening plains, the landscape that had almost swallowed her whole. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Sell him the land, take the money, and go somewhere east. Start over." It was sound advice. It was the only sensible thing to do. It was what the frightened woman she had been a few weeks ago would have done without hesitation. But something had changed in her. His presence, the quiet dignity of his labor, his unflinching defense of her, had rekindled a spark of defiance she thought long dead. "No," she said, the words stronger than she expected. "This was my husband's land. This is my home. I'm not running." Silas turned to look at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than emptiness in his eyes. It might have been surprise. It might have been respect. "Then you'll need to learn to shoot," he said. The lessons began the next day. Silas took Thomas's old rifle from its place behind the door, his handling of the weapon as natural and familiar as a farmer holding a hoe. He was a different man with a gun in his hands. The weariness fell away, replaced by a focused, lethal intensity. He was not a teacher given to patience or praise. His instructions were sparse, clinical. Brace it against your shoulder, firm. Don't fight the kick, become part of it. Breathe out as you squeeze, don't jerk the trigger. Your eyes see the target, your body does the work. Trust your body. He set up old tins on a fence post 50 yards away. Ilara's first shots were wild, the recoil jarring her shoulder, the loud report making her flinch. She missed every single one, the bullets kicking up dust far from their mark. Frustration and shame burned in her cheeks. She was clumsy, weak, a fool for thinking she could do this. "Again," was all he said. His voice was flat, devoid of judgment. He stood behind her, not touching her, but his presence was a physical weight, forcing her to focus. He corrected her stance with a single word: feet. He adjusted her grip with a brief gesture: lower. He made her dry fire the rifle 100 times, the empty click echoing in the stillness until the motion of raising the weapon, aligning the sights, and squeezing the trigger became a single, fluid extension of her will. She began to hate him for his dispassionate persistence, for the way he stripped the task down to its brutal mechanics, leaving no room for her fear or self-pity. But she also began to understand. He wasn't just teaching her to shoot. He was teaching her to control her fear, to quiet the frantic noise in her head, to find a center of calm in the midst of chaos. He was forging her into a weapon, just as life had forged him. Days bled into a week. Her shoulder ached, her ears rang, but she persisted. The tins began to dance. First one, then two, then all 5, one after another, the satisfying ping of lead hitting metal, a small victory against the overwhelming odds they faced. She discovered a core of stillness within herself she never knew existed. The rifle, once a terrifying object, became a tool. It felt balanced in her hands, an extension of her own newfound resolve. During one lesson, as she reloaded, she finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "The Cimarron territory," she said, not looking at him. The poster said, "Murder." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She thought he wouldn't answer. "It was a rancher and his sons," he said finally, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "They'd hired me to protect their claim. Turned out the claim they were protecting, they'd stolen from a family of settlers. Killed the parents, took the land. When I found out, I confronted them." He paused, and the silence was filled with the ghosts of his past. They weren't the kind of men who listened to reason. He didn't need to say more. She could imagine the rest. The cold, swift violence. The reason he was called the Ghost. He was not a common highwayman or a thief. He was a man with a code, however bloody and harsh it might be. He was a dispenser of a brutal personal justice in a land where the official kind was often for sale. The reward money should have gone to the settlers' orphaned children, he added, almost as an afterthought. "I expect the law kept it." He turned and walked away, the conversation over. He had given her a piece of his history, a glimpse into the abyss that had shaped him. It was more than he had likely given anyone in years. It was a form of trust, and it bound them together more tightly than any spoken promise. She raised the rifle again, her grip steady, her eye clear. She was no longer just Thomas Vance's widow. She was a woman standing her ground, and she would not be moved. The tins on the fence post awaited their judgment. The morning broke cold and gray, the sky the color of tarnished pewter. A nervous quiet had settled over the land, the kind that precedes a storm. The birds were silent. Ilara felt it in her bones, a low thrum of dread. Silas felt it too. He hadn't worked that morning. Instead, he'd cleaned and oiled his pistol, a long-barreled Colt with a ritualistic focus. He moved with a coiled tension, every sense alert. He had checked the rifle she would use, inspected the placement of the water barrels she had filled for cover, and scanned the horizon until his eyes must have ached. They didn't need to speak of it. They both knew Cain was coming. The final warning had been given, and the time for threats was over. The air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. They came near midday, not as a pair of thugs, but as an army. Ilara counted 12 riders cresting the low ridge to the east. Jedediah Cain was at their head, a large, florid man on a fine black horse, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the drab landscape. He looked less like a rancher and more like a corrupt king surveying a territory he already considered his own. They rode not with the haste of an attack, but with the slow, inexorable certainty of an execution squad. They fanned out, forming a loose semicircle around the homestead, their intentions clear. There would be no escape. Ilara's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Her hands, slick with sweat, gripped the stock of the rifle. All the practice, all the tin cans, seemed like a child's game in the face of this. These were men, and they had come to kill them. Silas stood on the porch, his duster pushed back to allow access to the Colt at his hip. He looked small and solitary against the backdrop of the house, a lone bulwark against the coming tide. "Silas Cain!" Cain's voice boomed across the yard, thick with arrogance. "I know who you are, the ghost of the Cimarron. Heard you were dead. Seems the stories were exaggerated." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Whatever this woman is paying you, I'll double it. Ride away now, and you'll live to see another sunset." Silas remained motionless, his face a mask of stone. His silence was his answer. Cain's face darkened. "Fool," he spat, "you had your chance. This is my valley, my land." He raised his hand, a signal to his men. The world seemed to slow down. Ilara saw the glint of sun on a rifle barrel, the tightening of a finger on a trigger. Beside her, Silas moved. It wasn't a fast movement, not a hurried draw. It was a fluid, economical unfolding, a motion of pure, deadly purpose. The Colt seemed to leap into his hand as if it were a living part of him. The first shot was a deafening crack that shattered the stillness. One of the riders, the man with the scarred lip from before, jerked in his saddle and fell, a blossom of red staining his shirt. The world exploded into a cacophony of gunfire, shouting, and the terrified whinnying of horses. Alara, frozen for a heartbeat, was jolted into action by Silas's sharp command. "Inside! The window!" She scrambled back into the house, her body moving on instinct and training. She rested the rifle on the sill of the window he had indicated, the one that gave her a clear line of sight on the men flanking the barn. She found a target, a man dismounting to take cover. She breathed out, squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man cried out and clutched his leg, falling into the dust. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. A small, fierce surge of adrenaline and triumph shot through her. She was not helpless. She was fighting back. Outside, Silas was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He moved from the cover of the porch to the corner of the house, never staying in one place for more than a second. He was not a man in a gunfight. He was a craftsman at his trade. 2 more of Cain's men went down, victims of his unnerving accuracy. The others, rattled by the swift, precise lethality of their opponent, began to fire wildly, their bullets splintering the walls of the house around Alara. A bullet tore through the wall near her head, showering her with splinters. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to reclaim her, but she pushed it down. She reloaded, her fingers clumsy but sure, and found another target. She fired and missed. Fired again. Another man went down, his rifle clattering in the dirt. The fight devolved into a brutal, desperate siege. The yard became a killing ground, littered with the bodies of Cain's men. Silas seemed to be everywhere at once, a phantom moving through the smoke and chaos. Alara lost track of time, lost track of how many shots she had fired. Her world narrowed to the view through her rifle sights, to the acrid smell of gunpowder and the ringing in her ears. She saw Cain, his face contorted with rage, taking cover behind the water trough, firing his pistol at Silas. He was the center of it all, the source of this violence. As long as he was standing, it would not end. She shifted her aim, drawing a bead on the large man. He was far and partially obscured, but she had hit the tins from this distance. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the metal rim of the trough with a loud clang, inches from Cain's head. He flinched back, his eyes searching wildly for the source of the shot. In that moment of distraction, he exposed himself. It was all the opening Silas needed. A single shot rang out, flat and final. Jedediah Cain stood up straight, a look of profound surprise on his face. He touched a hand to his chest, then crumpled to the ground. A stunned silence fell over the yard, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the frantic panting of Alara's own breath. The remaining few riders, their leader dead, stared for a moment in disbelief before scrambling for their horses and fleeing, disappearing back over the ridge as quickly as they had come. It was over. The silence that descended was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of death. The aftermath was a scene from a nightmare. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, hung heavy and still. The bodies of the men Cain had brought lay scattered in the yard, stark and surreal in the flat midday light. Alara emerged from the house, her legs unsteady, the rifle feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. The adrenaline that had sustained her drained away, leaving a hollow, trembling exhaustion in its wake. She looked at the carnage, at the cost of her small victory, and a wave of nausea washed over her. This was the price of her home. This was the brutal calculus of survival in this land. Silas stood near the porch, reloading his Colt with methodical, steady hands. He had a shallow graze on his forearm, a thin line of red against his dusty sleeve, but otherwise seemed untouched. Yet he was not the same man. The lethal focus was gone, replaced by a weariness that seemed to settle into the very marrow of his bones. The ghost of the Cimarron had appeared, done his bloody work, and now the haunted man, Silas Cain, was left to stand in the wreckage. He looked at her, and his gaze was not triumphant. It was filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. He saw the horror in her eyes, the way she clutched the rifle like a shield. "It's done," he said, his voice rough. "They won't be back." His words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed in the quiet yard with the finality of an epitaph. He walked over to the body of Jedediah Cain and nudged it with his boot, his face grim. He was a man well acquainted with death, and it offered him no satisfaction. He looked back at Alara. "You should get inside," he told her, his tone gentle for the first time. "The sheriff will be along eventually. He'll make a lot of noise, but with Cain gone, he'll have no choice but to call it self-defense." He was already thinking ahead, protecting her, planning her story. He was extricating himself from the narrative, ensuring that she would be seen as the victim who had defended her home, not the accomplice of a wanted killer. She couldn't move. She could only stare at him, the man who had saved her, the man who had brought this terrible violence to her doorstep. They were inextricably linked by the events of the last hour, their fates bound together by spilled blood. She had taken part in it, had fired the rifle, had seen a man fall because of her. She was no longer just a widow, no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, and that transformation felt as violent as the gunfight itself. Silas went to his horse, which had been tethered behind the barn, safe from the fighting. He checked the cinch, adjusted the saddlebags. His movements were slow, deliberate. Every motion screamed of departure. "You can't just leave," she said, the words coming out as a desperate plea. He stopped what he was doing, but didn't turn to face her. "Staying won't do you any good," he said, his back still to her. "My name is on a poster in town. With Cain dead, they'll need someone to blame. If I'm here, it'll be me. And you'll be the woman who harbored me. You'll lose this place anyway." His logic was cold, irrefutable. His presence had been her salvation, but his continued presence would be her ruin. He was a lightning rod for trouble, a ghost who could not afford to stay in one place for long. To protect her, he had to disappear. He was cutting her loose, not out of cruelty, but as a final act of guardianship. He was giving her back the life he had just saved. He finally turned to face her, his gray eyes holding a flicker of an emotion she couldn't name. It might have been regret. "You're strong, Alara," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded strange and intimate in the blood-soaked yard. "You don't need me. You never did. You just needed to remember how to fight." He swung himself up into the saddle, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him. He looked down at her, a tall, lonely figure against the vast, empty sky. For a moment, she wanted to beg him to stay, to offer him a place, a home. But she knew it was impossible. He was a man made for lonely roads and empty horizons, a man who could not outrun the ghosts that pursued him. He was the storm that had passed through, scouring her life clean, leaving her to rebuild in the aftermath. "Silas," she began, but she didn't know what to say. "Thank you? I'm sorry? Don't go?" All the words felt small and useless. He simply nodded, a final, silent acknowledgement. Then he turned his horse and rode away, not looking back. He rode east, toward the rising sun, a solitary figure slowly dissolving into the landscape that had made him. Alara stood alone in the quiet yard, the rifle still in her hands, watching him until he was gone. The silence he left behind was absolute. The fight was over. Her life was her own, and she had never felt so completely, terribly, and resiliently alone. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass, and it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a beginning.